The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as the clock ticked toward 10 a.m. In courtroom 3B of the Jefferson County Courthouse, it wasn't the defendant, the judge, or even the reporters that had everyone's attention. It was a man sitting quietly in the third row, Sergeant Major Daniel Ryker. Easily recognizable by the olive-drab dress uniform, polished medals, and the glint of silver in his hair, Ryker sat ramrod straight, not out of pride, but habit. The kind built over 2 decades of service. He had walked into that room not to testify, not to grandstand, but to support his daughter, Callie Ryker, a high school teacher wrongly suspended for allowing a student to read a veteran's letter aloud during class. But the uniform? It was a problem. Whispers turned into louder murmurs. A bailiff leaned over and spoke quietly into the judge's ear. Judge Morton, a man with a reputation for strict procedural decorum, raised an eyebrow. Then he looked directly at Ryker. "Sir," Judge Morton said, voice echoing through the chamber, "this is not a military tribunal. The court respectfully asks that you remove your uniform jacket or exit the premises." The room fell deathly silent. Daniel Ryker didn't flinch, didn't blink. He slowly rose. "I can take it off, Your Honor," he said. "But before I do, would you like to know why I wore it?" There was a pause, a sharp one, the kind that slices tension like a scalpel. "I don't believe your attire is appropriate for this setting, sir," Judge Morton replied curtly. "This is a civilian matter." Ryker nodded, reached for the top button of his jacket, then stopped. His voice was calm, controlled, but laced with something deeper. "May I explain something before I take it off?" The judge hesitated, briefly. And that's when it started. When the court came for a dress code and got a war story instead. The courtroom was silent, not the usual silence of boredom or disinterest, but the sharp stillness that falls when something unplanned begins. Everyone leaned in, even those who weren't sure why. Daniel Ryker stepped forward slowly, boots echoing across the floor with a deliberate weight. He stood just behind the defense table, eyes fixed not on the judge, but on a spot somewhere distant, a place no one in that room could see. "This jacket," he began, gently tugging at the fabric on his shoulder, "has seen more courtrooms than you'd think, but never one like this." His hand rested near a bronze star pinned to his chest. This was sewn on after Operation Resolute Passage in Kandahar. 2006. I was the last man out of a convoy that got hit by a roadside bomb. I carried a boy, Private Lugo, on my back for 5 miles while we were taking sniper fire. He didn't make it, but he asked me, before he died, to tell his mama he wasn't scared. He looked at the judge now. "That's why I kept wearing it, because I promised. Because when you bury people who wore the same colours as you, it doesn't come off. Not really." People in the gallery shifted uncomfortably. A younger man in a polo shirt, who had earlier scoffed when Ryker walked in, suddenly had his eyes fixed on the floor. Judge Morton adjusted his robe. "This courtroom," Ryker continued, "is filled with people who've never had to carry another person's blood on their uniform. I don't say that to insult you. I say it so you understand. This uniform isn't decoration. It's testimony." He held out one sleeve. "You see this stitch? That's not army regulation. That's from a field hospital in Mosul. I got nicked helping pull civilians out of a collapsed building. We were told not to go in. It wasn't secured. But a kid was screaming from inside, and I couldn't ignore that. That stitch is from someone who didn't ask what uniform I was wearing, just thanked me for not leaving them to die." Gasps. Someone near the back wiped their eyes. Ryker's voice didn't rise. He wasn't grandstanding. He was remembering. "I don't wear this to be seen. I wear it because some people can't anymore. And when I walked into this courtroom, into a public room where my daughter is being accused for letting a student honor a veteran, I thought maybe I'd stand silent. But the moment you told me to take it off," he looked directly at the judge, "was the moment I realized silence would be disrespectful." Judge Morton didn't respond. Neither did the bailiff, because no one knew what to say. And for the first time that morning, the courtroom felt less like a chamber and more like a reckoning. Daniel Ryker paused, eyes scanning the courtroom not for effect, but for connection. His daughter Callie sat at the defense table, hand over her mouth, eyes welling. She knew what was coming, not all of it, but enough to feel the weight. "You said this is a civilian courtroom," Ryker continued, voice steady, "and that's fair. But what do you think civilians are, Your Honour? We don't go to war and come back soldiers forever. We come back teachers, neighbours, parents, jurors. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out something small, a folded slip of paper, yellowed and creased. I keep this with me, he said, slowly unfolding it, because this is the medal they never gave. He held it up. People leaned in. It wasn't a medal. It was a child's drawing, crayon, faded from time, a stick figure in green next to a red heart. This was drawn by a little Afghan girl in 2011. Her village had been bombed the week before. We were sent in to clear a school compound. We found survivors, her among them. She didn't speak English. I didn't speak Pashto. But she gave me this before we left. He looked down at the drawing, reverently. And every courtroom I've ever sat in since, this came with me, because it reminds me what justice actually looks like. Someone in the gallery coughed to hide a sob. Even the court stenographer had momentarily stopped typing. Ryker tucked the drawing back into his pocket. I've been shot at, blown up, spit on in airports and thanked in grocery stores. I've watched politicians argue over wars they've never bled in. And through it all, I wore this uniform not because I had to, but because I chose to. He looked directly at the gallery now, at the reporters, at the teachers who had come to support his daughter, at the students who had skipped school to watch. My daughter didn't break a rule by letting a student read a letter from a fallen Marine. She upheld something bigger than policy. She reminded her class that behind every folded flag is a human being. He turned back to the judge. You asked me to take this off, but I need to ask you something now. The judge looked up, unsure. Ryker stepped forward, slow, deliberate. Why is a piece of fabric more threatening in this room than a lack of remembrance? Judge Morton leaned back in his chair. His fingers tapped the armrest in a rhythm that betrayed discomfort. For a man known for control, the courtroom was no longer his. Daniel Ryker stood still, hands at his sides, not clenched, not shaking, just rooted. My daughter's student, Ryker continued, read a letter written by Lance Corporal Henry Diaz. He was 19. He died in Fallujah, trying to drag his wounded sergeant behind cover. His last words were scribbled on a notepad that was blood-soaked by the time we found it. And that letter was what this school deemed too political for a history class. The judge shifted. Too political? Ryker repeated, voice rising now for the first time. A letter from a dead Marine to his family? That's not politics. That's sacrifice. That's reality. And if our students can't handle that, then we've failed them worse than any battlefield ever could. A woman in the gallery, middle-aged, pearls, conservative blazer, clutched a tissue to her nose. She'd been one of the ones who had originally filed a complaint against Callie for creating a controversial environment. Now her eyes were red. Ryker reached for the back of the chair in front of him. He didn't sit, just held it, like a man who knew standing was part of the message. You know what I see when I walk down the street in this uniform? He asked. Sometimes respect, sometimes indifference, sometimes fear, but mostly I see forgetfulness. He turned slightly to face the gallery again. Because somewhere along the way, this country started confusing uniforms with politics, and honouring service became optional, something you did on Veterans Day, if you remembered. He pointed to the courtroom walls. You got the state seal hanging behind you, Your Honour. You got a flag to your right, but you're uncomfortable with the real thing sitting 3 rows back, a living reminder, flesh and bone. Another pause. I didn't come here to make a scene. I didn't come to relive the worst years of my life. I came to support my daughter, but when you asked me to strip the symbol of that support off my back, something in me said, not this time. The judge opened his mouth, then closed it again. Because in a courtroom where silence once meant order, it now meant surrender. The courtroom door creaked as it opened. 2 high school students entered quietly, backpacks slung low, faces anxious. They slid into a back bench, unaware they were becoming part of a moment that would ripple far beyond Jefferson County. Daniel Ryker took a breath, the kind you take not to calm down, but to keep from cracking. I didn't wear this uniform to be saluted today, he said, turning back toward the judge. I wore it because when my daughter called me last week in tears, embarrassed, humiliated, suspended for honouring a Marine, I knew we were headed somewhere dangerous. He took a few steps forward. The bailiff didn't stop him. I wore it, he repeated, tapping his chest, because if we don't start visibly defending the people who still believe in service, sacrifice, and truth, then we're agreeing to hide them. He turned to face the gallery again. You all saw me walk in today. Some of you looked proud, some uncomfortable, some didn't look at all, but all of you saw me. That's why I wore it. His voice steadied, firmer now. Because the generation coming up, they need to see what we've been through, not sanitized, not dressed up for textbooks, seen. He pointed gently toward the students in the back. You think those kids will remember what was on the test? Or do you think they'll remember the day a teacher let a soldier's letter echo off the classroom walls? Judge Morton finally spoke. Mr. Ryker, while I sympathize, Ryker turned back to him with unwavering calm. With respect, Your Honor, he said, I don't want your sympathy, I want your understanding. Morton blinked. I want you to understand that this courtroom, this country, needs reminders. We don't get to grieve heroes one day a year and forget them the other 64. He paused. If my uniform bothers anyone, I ask you, why? If it stirs discomfort, then maybe we've gotten too used to forgetting. The court was dead silent again. Not a shuffle, not a cough. Ryker placed one hand over the rows of ribbons on his chest. Let them see me. Let them remember. Because behind every medal is a moment I would give anything to forget, but I wear it so they never have to. At that moment, one of the students in the back slowly rose to their feet, and the room felt like it was holding its breath. The student who had stood was no older than 16, thin-framed glasses, nervous hands. Her name was Ava Talley, quiet, unnoticed, until that moment. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her standing sent a ripple through the gallery, like someone had dropped a stone into still water. Her friend beside her looked up, then stood too, then another, then another. Within 30 seconds, nearly a dozen students, some from Callie Ryker's class, some not, rose to their feet in silent defiance of the courtroom's uncomfortable tension. Daniel Ryker turned and saw them, and for the first time since stepping to the front, he faltered. His shoulders shifted, jaw clenched, eyes glistened. They remember, he said softly, not to the judge, not even to the room, but maybe to the ghosts who never came back. Callie, sitting at the defense table, covered her mouth again, but this time not to stifle sorrow, only gratitude. The prosecutor looked bewildered. The judge stared forward, suddenly unsure who still held authority in the room. Then Ava spoke, barely above a whisper. He came to our school once. Sergeant Ryker. 3 years ago. He showed us the letter from the little girl in Afghanistan. I never forgot it. She looked directly at Judge Morton, and now never will. The judge's gavel remained untouched, because there was no chaos to control, no outburst to silence, just raw, unfiltered truth standing tall in the back of his courtroom. One teacher, one veteran, a letter, a moment, a movement. Ryker turned to face the bench one last time. You want me to remove this jacket? He asked quietly. I will, but only if you're ready to remove every plaque that thanks a soldier in this building, every seal that claims to represent justice, every statue that honors service while telling the living to stay silent. Morton didn't respond. Ryker took a slow breath. Because I didn't wear this to be political, I wore it to be remembered. And he started unbuttoning the jacket. Not in surrender, in challenge. Daniel Ryker's fingers moved with precision, slipping each brass button through its stitched loop one by one. As he slid the uniform jacket from his shoulders, the courtroom held its breath, like something sacred was being lowered, like a flag at dusk. He folded it gently, military style, crisp, intentional, not rushed, not defeated, and then he placed it on the defense table, next to his daughter. I can take it off, he said again, softly now, but it doesn't mean I stopped carrying it. The sight of the folded jacket struck something primal in the room. A quiet gasp came from the gallery. A veteran near the back straightened his posture. A woman in a business suit, one of the original accusers, lowered her head, visibly shaken. Callie reached out, laid her hand over the folded fabric. Her voice cracked. They told me to apologize, she whispered, for letting truth into the room, for not stopping that letter from being read. Ryker didn't turn toward her. He didn't need to. His voice was all the assurance she'd ever need. And what did you say? He asked, barely audible. She looked up. I said I'd apologize, after someone apologized to Lance Corporal Diaz. The crowd stirred, quiet nods, a few murmurs of agreement. The prosecutor's eyes flicked toward the gallery, nervous now, not about legal standing, but about public momentum. Judge Morton exhaled, slow and heavy. He leaned forward, clasped his hands. "Mr. Ryker," he said, voice stripped of its earlier formality, "I wasn't trying to disrespect your service, but the law." Ryker cut in, firm but respectful. "With all due respect, Your Honor, sometimes the law has to catch up to the truth. And the truth is, there's a reason this uniform bothers people. It reminds them." He stepped forward again. "It reminds them of sacrifice, of wars we'd rather forget, of men and women who died while the rest of the country was shopping for groceries or watching football." Another beat. "And if that makes people uncomfortable, good. Maybe that's where healing begins." No one moved. No one dared. Because this wasn't just a veteran standing bare-shouldered before the court. This was a man who had taken his scars and turned them into mirrors, and everyone was seeing their reflection. Judge Morton stared at the man before him, shirt pressed, jacket folded, presence undeniable. His hands hovered over the gavel, uncertain. For a judge who had ruled on hundreds of cases, this moment felt different. Not because of the law, but because of the truth pulsing in every corner of that room. The silence stretched. Then, footsteps. Slow, steady, deliberate. From the rear of the courtroom, an elderly woman stood. Her cane tapped rhythmically as she moved forward. No one stopped her. The bailiff watched, frozen in a mixture of duty and disbelief. She reached the front row and spoke, without asking permission. "My husband wore that uniform," she said, voice fragile but sharp, "and I buried him in it. He never got to speak like this. But you," she nodded at Ryker, "you just said what he couldn't." Ryker gave a small nod. No words, just mutual understanding. The woman turned to the judge. "I came today thinking this was about a teacher and a letter. I was wrong. This is about whether we still honor the people who fought for us when it's inconvenient." Judge Morton stood now. He didn't bang the gavel. Instead, he looked at Ryker, then Callie, then the folded jacket. "I don't know what the court's final decision will be," he admitted, his voice no longer iron but human. "But I do know something happened in this room today." He turned to the clerk. "Strike the record where I requested Mr. Ryker remove his jacket." The courtroom let out a collective breath, like a pressure valve had been released. A few people clapped, soft, respectful, not for show. Then Ryker spoke one last time that morning. "You asked me to remove a uniform," he said. "But maybe what we all needed was to uncover something deeper." He stepped back, stood beside his daughter, jacket still folded like a flag ready for remembrance. The judge nodded once. "Court will recess until further notice." But no one moved, because the trial might have paused, but the reckoning had just begun. The courtroom didn't empty the way courtrooms usually do. People didn't rush to check their phones or grab coffee. They lingered, some still seated, some standing in quiet reflection. Outside, the news had already spread. A local reporter, who'd only come expecting a brief disciplinary hearing, was now broadcasting live. Her voice trembled slightly as she held the mic. What started as a routine case against a school teacher has turned into something far greater. Veterans are arriving outside the courthouse by the dozens. Some in uniform, some in civilian clothes. But all of them say the same thing. We came because we heard someone finally said what we've all been thinking. Inside, Callie Ryker hugged her father tightly. For a long time, neither spoke. The words had already been said and echoed. What remained was the moment. The bailiff approached quietly. "Sir, I just wanted to say I served too. 82nd Airborne, Kabul, 2014. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen." Ryker gripped his hand. "You were never invisible. You just needed a louder room." Down the hall, teachers from Callie's school whispered among themselves. Some were in tears. Others made quiet vows. "We're going to fight this. We're going to stand with her now." And then came the ripple. By noon, the story had gone viral. Veterans groups shared clips of Ryker's speech. The student who stood first, Ava, posted a selfie outside the courtroom with the caption, "I stood today, so they'd never be forgotten tomorrow." It was shared 70,000 times in 3 hours. Across the country, classrooms began reading the fallen Marine's letter aloud. Some principals protested, most didn't. A state senator tweeted, "If a uniform in a courtroom shakes us more than the silence of forgetting does, then maybe it's time we remember who we are." And in Jefferson County, something began shifting, slowly but undeniably. Policy was questioned. People were listening. And Sergeant Major Daniel Ryker, now walking slowly out of the building beside his daughter, had no idea the mural that would be painted in that hallway a week later would show him standing, not in uniform, but holding it folded like a sacred truth, with students behind him and a single word stenciled beneath. Present. A week passed. Then 2. By the end of the month, the hallway outside courtroom 3B looked different. The marble was still cold, the lights still harsh, but now, just above the bench where people used to sit and wait for their hearings, a mural stretched across the wall. It wasn't flashy, no flags waving, no tanks or medals, just a single man, Daniel Ryker, painted in quiet reverence, standing tall in a white shirt, his uniform folded in his arms like a sacred trust. Behind him, silhouettes of students, teachers, and fallen soldiers, faces soft but unmistakable. The inscription below read, "He wore it so we wouldn't forget." Back in that same courtroom, Judge Morton sat reviewing a letter from the Department of Education. New guidance had been issued. Letters from military personnel, active or fallen, are not to be censored if presented in an educational context, it said. They are history. They are legacy. Callie Ryker was reinstated with full honours. Her students welcomed her back with silence at first. Then, one by one, they stood at their desks. No one instructed them to. It just happened. And Daniel Ryker? He returned to his routine, early mornings, coffee shops, volunteering at the local VA. He didn't chase the spotlight, he declined interviews. But once a week, he visited the school, not to lecture, to listen. One afternoon, a young boy, barely 12, stayed after class and asked him, "Were you scared in war?" Ryker didn't answer right away, then he nodded. "Every day," he said, "but I wore this." He tapped the folded jacket on his lap, so other people didn't have to be. The boy thought for a moment, then said, "I think that's what heroes do." Ryker smiled faintly. "Maybe, but sometimes all heroes need is a classroom, a courtroom, or one student willing to stand." The boy left, but the words stayed. And far beyond Jefferson County, in towns that never heard of Callie Ryker or her father, veterans began walking into courtrooms wearing their uniforms again. Not in protest, in presence, because one man stood, because one daughter believed, because a room full of strangers finally listened, and because truth, when spoken calmly, humbly, and unapologetically, can flip more than just a courtroom. It can flip a nation back to remembering what matters.